Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's panel discussion brought to you by the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government and Protect Democracy. This is a conversation with scholars to discuss the background of the Senate filibuster and its implications for governance. Thank you all for joining us. Now, I'm sure you're all here because the filibuster is having another moment. This is, of course, a procedural tool that has been fiercely debated and not a few times reformed. So this new wave of dialogue today has a very long history behind it. But much of that dialogue is, to put it charitably, shrouded in myths and misconceptions. Is the filibuster, as one senator recently put it, part of the foundation of our republic? Did the framers weigh in on the question of supermajority requirements? And if so, what did they say? There are a lot of claims about how the filibuster impacts the work of Congress today, that it increases bipartisanship, or that it fosters more continuity in policymaking, and so forth. But this is, of course, where scholarship becomes central to the filibuster debate. It can help us separate fact from fiction, to examine the historical record, and to more critically interrogate the merits of various arguments. Especially in a heated political environment like this one, this becomes all the more critical to root our conversation in fact and scholarship. So in that spirit, we have with us today four of the leading scholars in the country on Congress and congressional procedure, the Constitution, and the filibuster. First, we have Catherine Fisk, who is the Barbara Nachtrieb Armstrong Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. Go Bears. Then we have Ken Shepsle, who is a George D. Markham Professor of Government at Harvard University. We have Gisela Sin, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Illinois. And then last, we have William Howell, who is the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago. And I will note the director of the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government, which is our partner in this event today. Professors Fisk, Shepsle, Sin, and Howell, thank you all for being with us today to share your insights. They're all going to share just a couple of opening remarks, and then we are going to open the conversation, including by answering your questions. So to that end, you can submit your questions via the Zoom chat at any time during this program. Please do include your name, your affiliation, and to which speaker your question is directed. You can also let us know if you'd like to ask a question out loud using the raise hand feature located at the bottom center of your screen. We'll call on you and you can ask your question out loud. And now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Howell to get the conversation started. And I want to say a particular thanks to Professor Howell and his remarkable team at the Center for Effective Government. We are so thrilled to be hosting this event together with all of you. Will, floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks for bringing us together and for leading us through this really important conversation. I couldn't be more delighted than to be on this panel with these terrific group of scholars. And I think I just want to make sort of 2 points to kind of jumpstart what I hope will be a rather free-flowing, maybe even a rollicking conversation about the filibuster. And so the first is to simply note that the filibuster is not sacrosanct. Rules, like institutions, are not fixed evermore. The filibuster did not exist at our nation's founding. And in important ways, it wasn't created through deliberation and with intention, but largely through happenstance, as it turns out. The possibility of ending a filibuster wasn't established until 1917 with Rule 22 by cloture that was set at where a cloture, that is the number of senators you had to get on board in order to end the filibuster, was set at 2/3, and then that was changed in 1976 to 3/5. New categories of legislation have been introduced that are not subject to the filibuster over time, things like reconciliation bills. The norms of their usage has changed dramatically over time, such that we see them as a regular, in the regular course of legislating, them being used, filibusters being used, rather than being done so selectively. Judicial appointments at the district and appellate level, right, were first excluded from the filibuster, and now the Supreme Court as well, all of which now are voted on a strictly majoritarian basis. And so when we talk about the filibuster, it's worth recognizing that it's a moving target, and that thinking about how we might change it is perfectly consistent with the history of the filibuster. Then when we turn to these conversations, I think it's worth noting that when evaluating the merits of a rule or a practice, we need to think about whether it enhances governance. We don't get to reason from policy, ideological, or partisan conviction. Rather, what we need to do is ask whether a rule or a practice enhances the representation of popular interests and enables elected officials to act upon those interests. And so, when turning to the filibuster, we might ask whether or not it improves our ability to speak across difference, to constructively adjudicate our disagreements, to produce better laws that represent the interests in a better way of the larger population. And just now, in this era of hyperpolarization and congressional dysfunction and legislative gridlock, I think there's overwhelming evidence that it does not. Rather, in the main, what the filibuster does is turn bad to worse. There's simply no evidence that the filibuster improves the quality of legislation. It augments deliberation or promotes policy stability in any meaningful sense. And there's a great deal of evidence, meanwhile, that it stifles debate. It encourages the exercise of unilateral powers of a president. It yields massive, complex omnibus legislation on spending items and gridlock most everywhere else. And so doing, it all but guarantees that an obstructionist minority, and in this era of polarization, and a minority that is ideologically extreme relative to the larger population, that such an obstructionist minority can undermine the capacity of Congress to govern. This isn't to say that what we should do is automatically get rid of the filibuster altogether. I think there are real concerns about representation that we have to grapple with. And I'll just give a shout out right now to one of my fellow panelists, Ken Shepsle, who's written a great article suggesting one way to attend to these problems. But the value of the rules that we consider should be understood instrumentally. And I think it's on this point that I want to end. We need to think about the value of rules in terms of their ability to enhance government and promote the capacity of elected officials to solve pressing problems. For a government that routinely fails to address the needs and wants of a people, frankly, will not endure. This rule, in my view, doesn't adequately meet those instrumental objectives. Rather than facilitating dialogue and problem solving, it impedes them. Our nation faces really pressing threats that we cannot address as long as the filibuster persists. And unless we find a way to address them, I think our democracy stands in real peril. So on that provocative note, I'll end and look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say.
Thank you, Will. And next, Professor Sin.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Thank you to the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government and Protect Democracy for organizing this panel and for inviting me. So, okay, so I would like to make 3 points. So first, as the letter says, and Will also mention it, the filibuster in the Senate was not part of the Founding Fathers' constitutional vision for the Senate. It was also not common in the 19th century Senate. Filibustering was in fact a lot more common in the House, and it mostly consisted on making parliamentary motions to waste time, like proposing to table a bill or that the chamber adjourns for the day, and also consisted on using what is called the disappearing quorum, which consists of members being present in the chamber but not voting, in the hopes that the quorum necessary to approve a bill could not be reached. So what we now know as the Rule 22 was enacted in 1917. Before then, simple majorities were often able to pass legislation. So we wonder how these 60 votes Senate emerged. Well, before the 1960s, the filibuster, and many people have shown this, it was a true game of exhaustion. So the minority was required to hold the floor by continuously speaking, and this meant that the speaking senator had to, stand at his desk, talk constantly without taking any breaks, moving about. And at the same time, the majority had to ensure that they had enough senators on hand to form a quorum at a moment's notice. If the majority could not form a quorum, then the session would come to a halt and the Senate would adjourn. And the consequence of this adjournment is basically that the minority would take a break and reinitiate the filibuster on the next legislative day. So by having a quorum available, the majority forced the minority to continue speaking indefinitely. So whoever could last longer won the game. So the cost of of waiting out a filibuster were high, not only on the minority who had to keep talking, but also the majority who had to be on the floor. And senators were not only unable to, engage in other Senate business, but also preventing from campaigning, from fundraising. And that's why now it's enough to just express the leadership, the intention to filibuster, and that's it. And now you may wonder, wait, why has the filibuster been able to endure for so long when a simple majority of senators could have completely changed it at any time? And I find that the most interesting thing. And, well, first, as we know, the filibuster provides individual senators with leverage and bargaining power. Even the threat of filibuster can get senators concession from the opposition, from the House, from the president. It also increases the visibility of a particular senator. It brings an issue to public's attention. But I also think that in many ways, it helps the majority party. As I said, any simple majority could have gotten rid of the filibuster if they really wanted it, but they decided not to. And I think this is in part because under certain conditions, the majority benefits from shifting this blame to the minority party. And what are the conditions? Well, first, if the majority party is highly factionalized, then it is easier to blame the minority than trying to put together a majority of 51 senators to approve something. And then second, when there's no agreement with the president. I mean, the filibuster offers still some protection from the whims of the executive branch. And again, it is easier to blame the minority not getting something done than to oppose or confront a president, especially if it is from the same party. And we can imagine this happening also, in the last Republican majority, during the last Republican majority party. So the third thing I want to say is, what about the world? Well, all other presidential systems in the world do have a Senate that resembles pretty much the Senate in the US. It resembles in terms of misrepresentation or biases in favor of smaller states. There are some differences and probably the most consequential one is that in most countries, the House and the Senate do not have equal powers. The Senate might be more or less powerful than the House. In some cases, the Senate cannot stop legislation. In others, it has a lot more power than the House. And yes, of course, there is obstruction too in other presidential systems. But, and I think this is a big difference, in other presidential systems, legislative elections are through proportional representation. So this favors the existence of multiple parties. So no party has an absolute majority like in the US. So what happens? Well, one tool that the minority parties use is this disappearing quorum, not providing quorum to conduct businesses in the Senate. But still, this is not super majoritarian. This is just 50+1 majority. But what it does is that it forces this political party to build coalitions with other, like in a parliamentary system, with other parties to get that quorum working. And they do it just as in parliamentary system, in presidential system, they give cabinet position to leaders of different parties, and they try to get this governing majority in Congress and try to govern. But there's a lot more negotiations within the majority or within that majority coalition that probably within a majority party in the United States. So that's all I want to say for now.
Thank you. And now Professor Fisk.
Thank you. As other speakers have said, the modern filibuster is far more powerful than filibusters were before the 1970s because it doesn't require debate. It simply is a form of minority veto. It offers a minority of senators, as few as one, representing an even smaller minority of the population of the country, a stronger veto than filibusters before the 1960s, with less political accountability. The current Rule 22, which requires 60 votes to enact legislation, is unconstitutional and it's bad for government. As for it being unconstitutional, the Constitution specifies 7 instances in which a supermajority vote is required: to remove an officer after impeachment, to expel a member of either House of Congress, to override a presidential veto, to ratify treaties by the Senate, to remove a disability from serving in elective office after having participated in a rebellion or insurrection, to determine that the president is disabled from office under the 25th Amendment, and to amend the Constitution. Moreover, the Constitution also specifies that the vice president shall have no vote unless the Senate is equally divided, which suggests that the Constitution envisions majority rule being the usual rule for Senate business. I should point out that the filibuster, as it has been practiced since 1917, and especially since the 1940s, has been used almost always, although not always, to block civil rights legislation. Sorry about my dog. And so I think this filibuster is bad for government. As others have suggested, it prevents political accountability by preventing the House and the President and the Senate majority from enacting the policies that voters voted for them to adopt. It prevents Congress from acting at all, which shifts power to the executive branch, and presidents have been using presidential executive statements to achieve policy to an increasing extent. It forces Congress to use either the budget reconciliation process or omnibus legislation to enact laws, which means that every time the Supreme Court says, when interpreting legislation, this problem could be fixed by Congress, they're making it up. It couldn't be fixed by Congress because it's very hard for Congress to enact targeted surgical legislation to address a simple problem. And of course, it currently is being used to prevent Congress from enacting laws that would be necessary to address erroneous interpretations of legislation. So it's been preventing adopting labor law reform and the enactment of the PRO Act. It's currently being used to prevent voting rights legislation. It's being used to block police reform. And so it's both unconstitutional and bad policy.
Thank you. And Professor Shepsle, last but not least.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honor. And I would like to thank our hosts for inviting me and including me. I will end up reiterating a number of points that have already been made. The first is that the filibuster problem is really two problems. It is one of minority obstruction, that is, a minority can prevent a majority from acting, and this is the aspect of the filibuster that has received the most attention by the political class and the press. But there is a second problem with the filibuster. It will exacerbate the distortions caused by apportionment in the Senate, the requirement that there are two senators from each state, independent of population. That is, if we eliminate the filibuster, we will solve problem number one. We will no longer have minorities able to prevent majorities from acting, but we will exacerbate problem number two, which will mean that small majorities in the Senate will be able to enact very unpopular legislation or make confirm unpopular appointments. I would point out that none of President Trump's 3 Supreme Court nominees was favored by a majority of the population. I would point out that Trump's tax legislation in 2017 was not supported by a majority of the population. This is the apportionment problem that eliminating the filibuster would exacerbate. Each of the examples I just gave were examples of actions by the Senate that were not governed by the filibuster, that simple majorities could act either through reconciliation for the tax law or through the appointments activity, which is not governed by, which is by simple majority. So be careful what you wish for. Eliminating the filibuster may exacerbate rather than remove obstacles to good public policy. Two of my very bright law collaborators, Jonathan Gould at Berkeley Law, Catherine's colleague, and Matthew Stevenson at Harvard Law, my colleague, and I have written on this recently and made a modest proposal, which appeared as an op-ed in the Washington Post and will now come out as a full-blown law school type paper in the Journal of Legal Analysis. And it's called the majoritarian filibuster. And it would involve changing Rule 22 of the Senate to allow the Senate to proceed to a vote if a simple majority of senators representing a simple majority of the population voted so. So it would revise the current filibuster rule without getting rid of it altogether. So that's one point I would like to make, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. It gets into the weeds a bit later. Two other points, and then I'll stop filibustering. The first point is the relationship of the filibuster to the separation of powers. The filibuster gridlocks the legislature, making it irrelevant. Except for nominations and reconciliation, the legislature is gridlocked and unable to act. It is not only a dysfunctional, it is a non-functioning legislature. It cannot legislate. The consequence is government by executive order. And we have observed with W and Obama and Trump and Biden increasingly using executive orders as a way to make policy in light of the fact that the legislature cannot legislate. The executive is constrained by the courts, but the courts prove to be a rather weak constraint on the executive, which continually pushes the envelope unless a court eventually slaps its wrists. The final point I want to make is about the talking filibuster, a proposal that has been made recently, which I think is silly. I think it's silly because while it burdens the minority to mount a filibuster, it also exhausts plenary time. And plenary time is the valuable thing that a proactive government needs to pass laws and make policy. And so moving to a talking filibuster, it seems to me, would be counterproductive because it would exhaust plenary time. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professors Howell, Sin, Shepsle, and Fisk. Now let's open this conversation up. As a reminder to everyone, you can submit your questions for our panelists by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom center of your screen or through the chat feature. Again, please do include your name, your affiliation, and to whom your question is directed. I want to quickly note that our speakers today are 4 of the more than 350 scholars who recently called for filibuster reform in a letter to congressional leaders. And I know that there are a number of other of the signatories of that letter on this call. And so I just want to very quickly invite any of you, if you would like, to raise your hand and add any other important points that we may have missed here. But before we open to questions, I want to start with a question of my own for Professor Howell. So again, all of you are more than 350 scholars who have called collectively for filibuster reform. But I think there's a perception in Washington that the filibuster is a deeply controversial question. But when it comes to the people who study our democracy, is this all similarly controversial? I mean, how widely shared are these views that the 4 of you who talked about today among political scientists, historians, and legal scholars?
All right-thinking people recognize that the filibuster is problematic. So how universal? Hard to say. I would say, I mean, most of the academics who I know see real trade-offs involved. And in period of widening kind of polarization between the two major parties and the deep dysfunction of the legislative process more generally. I think there's a growing recognition among scholars, political scientists, legal scholars, that this particular rule that we've inherited warrants revisiting, just as past people have revisited this particular rule and sought to make changes to it. If I could, I want to underscore one thing which I think is really important for this conversation, which speaks to Ken's second point, which is that when we think about the significance of the filibuster, I think we're accustomed to saying, well, there are a set of laws that would be enacted that aren't enacted. And that sort of puts it, and that's the extent to which the filibuster has an effect. And that, of course, is true. It can have this blocking function, but that there are these carryover effects as well. These spillover effects. So it's not an accident that presidents exercise their unilateral powers, as Catherine pointed out as well. That you're exercising these unilateral powers with greater and greater frequency. That to the extent that we're issuing policy change, we're doing it by executive fiat, not through a legislative process. It's not an accident that now, whenever we get these laws, they take the form of these unbelievably complex omnibus pieces of legislation, wherein legislators try to stuff them with every conceivable provision, which are not in the service of problem solving or accountability or deliberation. They're in the service of just trying to get something through with this one opportunity that's available through reconciliation. And so there too, I mean, is the mark of the filibuster on our politics, and both are really problematic.
Thank you. Well, now I want to go to a first question. Oh, and I see his hand just went back down, but Tom Coleman, Congressman Tom Coleman, who is an advisor to Protect Democracy. Tom, are you here? Can you hear me?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Go ahead, Congressman.
Thank you. I really appreciate the panel. I mean, I don't disagree with anything anybody said here. Now, I come from the House of Representatives. I served for 16 years. And the filibuster was known about, was problematical, but we kind of tended to our own garden in the House and let the Senate deal with its problems. However, I did ask a senior senator once, when the Democrats were in control and when I thought they were abusing the system because they weren't allowing our House bills to pass or even be considered, whether or not it would be something that they could do something about. And his answer was a mealy mouth answer. I mean, he wouldn't come down on one side or the other, which leads me to believe that if you take it out of the sphere of academics, these people who are in the Senate they're acting on this issue out of fear of being in the minority. That's what the Democrats, that's the only thing I can think of today, that the Democrats who have control of the entire federal government fear that they might lose the majority in a year and a half or whatever it is, or in 3 or 4 years, and that they would be then the shoe on the other foot. So I think you have to get over this fear factor, and that goes to the integrity and the quality of the individuals occupying these positions in the Senate. So, you know, that's a whole other question, but I do think it's based on fear. Professor Sin said about the blame shifting. We have the blame game going on 24/7. We don't need any other excuse to have a blame game going on. The other thing is, I think that the filibuster is not understood by the public. I have never seen a poll on it. Maybe some of you have, but we're talking inside baseball. You know, it used to be called inside baseball. You all knew the rules and all the players and all the averages. That's what we're doing today. I think the problem with the filibuster is it does erode the credibility of the Congress, the Senate in particular. It does shift all these things to the executive, and the public doesn't understand that, so they just don't like any of it. And I think it's a public attitude that the filibuster is enhancing by maintaining it. I think, like everything, then the Constitution has been interpreted through 200 plus years differently than it originally was. The United States Senate needs to come into the 21st century and recognize that the majority of the people of the country want a majority of the things they believe in. And if you don't represent the majority, you put together a coalition to have a majority against or for or whatever it is. But it stifles coalition building, creates more polarization, and keeps us at the mercy of people who don't have the country's best interest at heart. So thank you, Ben, for asking. I have answered much more than you probably wanted, but I will listen to all of you some more. I really appreciate what you've done here, and I hope you continue. I didn't know about the 350 scholars in the letter. There's so many letters going out, for and against this or that, but this is a significant 350 of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate that. And I want to put a specific point on something you raised with maybe a follow-up question for Professor Sin. What is the role of negative polarization in all of this, and the sort of increasing drive of politics to be more around responding to fear or resistance to what the other side is trying to do, rather than trying to deliver positive policy proposals? You're on mute.
There it is. You would think that after a year I would know, but still forget. So okay, so about the fear. So I do think that these the fact that the minority can exploit this procedure in order to become the majority in a short term, and and achieve the policy goals. And I think that's, it feels like an arms race in some point of these two polarized parties, fighting each other. I mean, on the other hand, if a majority, like a 51 senators, think that its ability to keep being the majority or to keep having power in the Senate or their re-election is under threat by minority obstruction, then they might take the steps to limit these minority tactics. And I think that's what is that's what we may see or not. I think that whenever they face a situation, the coalitions ask, okay, what's the world gonna look like with either this change in policy or with these changes in the rules, and the members of the majority party make a decision there. And we were talking about it before, that it might be true that HR 1 is a very important bill that will sustain or will ensure or may threaten many people's survival in their re-election bids. And I do think that might be one bill for which the filibuster may change, that they may relax or chip away some of this power to pass this bill, because it affects re-election of so many legislators or senators too. So so that's my answer.
Thank you. Next, I have a question in the chat from Daryl Ehrlich, who is a reporter from the Daily Montanan and States newsroom. 2 questions. First, will you make available the letter signed by more than 350 professors? I can answer that, Daryl. Yes, we will. We will make sure that everyone who attended this event has a copy of that letter. And then second, will Professor Shepsle describe briefly how his proposed modification would work? Let him go into the weeds. Ken, you have permission to go into the weeds.
Okay, you asked for it. The idea is this, as I said, that there is both minority obstruction that the current filibuster permits, and there is the distortion owing to malapportionment of the Senate that eliminating the filibuster would permit. And so the question is, how do we solve one problem without exacerbating the other? And our proposed solution is that Rule 22, the language of Rule 22 of the Senate standing rules be changed so that the motion to proceed to a vote can be approved if a majority of senators representing a majority of the population vote yay. And likewise, a filibuster can continue if even a minority of senators prefer to continue the filibuster if they represent a majority of the population. The key is to democratize the filibuster, to allow the filibuster to act in the interests of a majority of the population. So that's how our particular rule would proceed. But let me add an even more general point, and maybe this is more academic than you might like, but rules are, as Will pointed, rules are just rules, but they're also public goods for the legislators. They are enjoyed in common by all the legislators. And so I think the idea of filibuster reform may be too narrow a focus and unfortunately fall on the sword of polarization. Rather, one should think about a broader mandate for reforming Senate rules. One could imagine a Senate commission or select committee, something they were unable to support for the recent proposal to investigate the insurrection at the Capitol. But perhaps a bipartisan majority might support a bipartisan select committee that would examine the rules holistically, so that some things that affect a minority, like the ability of the majority leader to fill in the decision tree to prevent minority amendments, could be on the table along with reforming the filibuster, so that minorities might be protected as well as majorities being energized to pass legislation. So that would be a broader proposal, not merely filibuster reform, but rules reform.
Thank you, Ken. And now I have a question in the chat from Nancy Wang, who is the Executive Director of Voters Not Politicians. The question is, has the filibuster been used and abused equally by both parties in the modern era? This, I think, could be a question for anyone, but perhaps Professor Fisk, do you have an immediate response to this?
Sure, it depends on what you mean by the modern era. If you mean roughly since 1917, at least until the modern, that is the contemporary version of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party came into effect, the filibuster was somewhat bipartisan because it was used by Southern Democratic senators and often small state Republicans to block civil rights legislation. But it was occasionally used, as it was, for example, in 1947, by large state Democrats, who were the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party at the time, to block the Taft-Hartley Act. It was unsuccessful in blocking the Taft-Hartley Act, which was a piece of deeply anti-labor legislation that's still on the books. The parties now are much more ideologically uniform than they were in the 1960s. That is, the most conservative Democrat is still to the left of the most liberal Republican for the most part. And so now the filibuster is typically less bipartisan than it was. Of course, it also is a function of who has had the majority of the Senate, because by definition, the filibuster tends to be used by the minority. But I'd want to let one of the political scientists jump in and talk a little bit more in answer to that question, if you'd like.
Could I point out one thing? I mean, it's not an accident right now that support for filibuster reform is disproportionately found among Democrats and opposition is disproportionately found among Republicans. And it's not just because the Democrats are currently in control. Right now, the Democratic Party would like to extend the reach of government in lots of different ways to solve lots of different problems. And they need, in order to be able to perform those functions, they need to pass legislation. and they're blocked from effectively doing so. And meanwhile, Republicans can get much of what they like, which is through deregulation and tax cuts, through the unilateral powers of the president and through reconciliation. And so a world in which the lawmaking process is all but impossible to traverse redounds, I think, to the benefit of Republicans who would just as soon not see Congress set to work on big spending bills and attending to disparities between the rich and the poor and climate change and so forth. And so for that reason, I think that's how this particular, in these kinds of ways, why there's a partisan inflection to these debates about what would otherwise appear to be an obscure Senate rule.
Thank you both. Now I have a question from Dan Balls, who is the chief correspondent at the Washington Post. Do any other Democratic governments have anything like the filibuster to stymie debate, or is it unique to the US Senate? I think perhaps Gisela, this is a question best for you. You're on mute again.
Yes, so no, the other, I mean, as I mentioned, there has been other places before, for instance, the Second Republic in Spain had something like the filibuster, in which they would keep talking and they would never, you know, they don't have to, vote. Other legislators of the ones I know, and especially most of my expertise is in Latin America, they do not. They have, they use many of these dilatory tactics, that I mentioned before, or even the disappearing quorum. But all those things can be overcome with an absolute, what is called an absolute majority, that is 50 plus 1. And I think that makes a big difference. But, and as I mentioned before, the other big difference with the US is that all these countries have multi-party governments. So that it also doesn't give just one party absolute majority and that it does whatever it wants, mainly because that party needs to build a coalition with other parties in order to get that 50 plus 1. Parties in general use this disappearing quorum. They don't provide quorum, so then they cannot conduct business. But because whoever has the simple majority, which usually is, let's say, 25, 30% of the seats, need to negotiate with the others, you still have policies that are negotiated, that are a compromise, and that do not tend to be too extreme. And you need to negotiate with other parties. So I think that's what makes it very different. It's the fact that you need to build a coalition, and it's not party government in the sense that we would think about in the U.S. House. And they have designed different ways to build this coalition. And I think, and as I said, probably the most common way is to give cabinet positions to members of different parties. And that provides them with support in the legislature. Is to build a majority coalition, just like in any parliamentary system.
I want to follow up on this line of discussion with a question for Professor Howell. How does this interact with the U.S. party system? And I think there's perhaps a fear when it comes to talking about the filibuster that sort of monolithic party structures will be able to run amok through the policy process. But how true is it that there's still not coalition building that would have to happen even to get to 50 plus 1 in the Senate? I mean, how much is that actually a risk that you would have unpopular or unwise legislation sort of rushed through overnight?
Well, the lawmaking process requires one still to get through the House and the Senate, still would be subject to a presidential veto, still would be subject to the scrutiny of the judiciary. I don't think we see much evidence that in matters involving spending or tax cuts that we see wild fluctuations from the left to the right as a function of the latest election, or in matters involving trade, where we think about fast track authority, there too, we see actually a remarkable amount of stability. Where we don't see stability, or where we see less stability, is when it comes to the unilateral powers that presidents wield. That issuing, a set of, what is the first thing that Trump did? He issued a whole bunch of orders that meant to undo things that Obama did. And that's precisely what Biden is doing now vis-a-vis Trump. And as we've discussed, presidents' incentives to exercise these powers only go up when the legislative process is all but impossible to navigate. One last thing, which is, I think, is just a sort of a note that's worth keeping in mind when we debate the merits of any particular rule change, is that an argument that's not available to us in a democracy is one in which we say that this allotment of power is fine as long as my people are in power. And that when the other guys assume authority, well, then we're going to have to reconsider. The debate, and I think we've done a good job in the course of this conversation, the debate about the merits of any particular governing arrangement need to be with an eye towards the benefits of representation or capacity to govern, not with an eye towards privileging one particular set of policy objectives. I'll say, and as was pointed out by the congressman earlier, to the extent that this debate percolates into the public sphere, it's driven almost entirely by those kinds of concerns. It's that, well, I'm fine with giving all power to the president or relaxing this rule, but only as long as the Democrats are in control, or only as long as the Republicans are in control. And that kind of reasoning, I think we need to simply dispense with, because it's not an argument that's available to us in a democracy.
Ben, can I chime in on this?
Yeah. Go right ahead.
I think if you asked Leader Schumer about his highly organized, monolithic Democratic Party in the Senate, he would ask, what planet do you live on? I don't think the Democratic Party in the Senate is monolithic. Even the Republican Party, which is perhaps more organized and centrally directed than in a long time, has its outliers. And so I think the idea of monolithic parties is still something pretty foreign to the American experience. That's the first point. The second point I would make, and I would follow up on Gisella's point, is that in many other democracies, because the governments are multi-party, it's not clear what a minority means. There's an opposition, that is the parties not in the government, but many of the parties in the government are themselves minorities, but they happen to be participating in government and given a piece of the action. And that's not an option that our system permits quite so easily.
Thank you. Thank you all. Now I have a question from Tom Brune, who is the Washington Bureau Chief of Newsday. And I think this is probably a question best for Catherine and for Will, but what will the Senate look like without a filibuster? Will it become a 100-member version of the House? Will ending or severely weakening the filibuster foster more cooperation, or will it entrench partisan power even more so?
We know a little bit about what the Senate looks like without the filibuster, because it was eliminated for confirmation of executive branch officers as well as for judges. And what it is a majority vote system, but that has a long tradition of a fair amount of deference to the views of individual senators. And so thus, as was pointed out, President Trump's Supreme Court nominees were all confirmed by very narrow majorities. And in the case of Justice Kavanaugh, he didn't even get a majority, but not all senators were voting. It was 49 to 48 for him. So I think what we will see is the Senate being a obviously smaller version of the House. But what we will see is the ability of the majority to enact legislation. And so this might restore some of the power that committees have to negotiate with the House over the shape of legislation. It might enable the enactment of legislation that is more specifically targeted at specific issues like qualified immunity for government officials and the way that that relates to police misconduct. It's a problem that was entirely invented by the Supreme Court with creating a concept of qualified immunity that is not in statutes, and it is a problem that Congress has to fix. And so I don't think that we're going to see the Senate looking exactly like the House, but what we will see is the Senate being able to operate by majority rule, which now it cannot.
Thank you.
I agree. If I could, there's another piece to this too, which is I think that just as we're more likely to see the enactment of well-defined bills, I think we can expect to see an improvement in deliberation. Deliberation about the merits of different policy reforms. A world like the world we inhabit, wherein it's all but impossible to get to 60, is a world that invites further polarization and grandstanding, just as it all but excludes serious-minded deliberations about a whole host of meritorious policies that simply aren't talked about, that aren't brought before the Senate in a meaningful way and actually debated. If you allow for a majority to be decisive, and I quite like, I mean, I count me among those who want to offer a ringing endorsement of Ken's proposal, because there is this pathology associated with minority governance, a minority of a population. But where it's possible to actually legislate ought to facilitate meaningful dialogue about hard problems that we face, and that too would be improved.
I would add one other feature, that we can't measure the pieces of legislation that might have been introduced if there weren't a filibuster, but haven't been introduced, or have been introduced and not taken up by committee, or taken up by committee and not passed on.
Ken, you ended up on mute.
I just see that. So I think one of the things that we need to take on board is the fact that there are a lot of things that the Senate doesn't consider because of the filibuster, and we may be liberated to consider these things in the absence of a filibuster.
And I just want to add to that, that also things that don't come out, or that come out in a way that, you know, it has a form, the bill has a form because it knows it's not going anywhere. If they knew that this has a real possibility of becoming a law, the negotiation within the Democratic Party probably would be completely different, because people know it's going somewhere, but because they know, okay, it's not going to be passed. I mean, I'm not going to spend political capital there, or I let it have people have that bill for their constituency, etc. So I think it would be a lot different.
And I want to follow up with that with a stat that I find really interesting in this conversation, is that if you just run the numbers on the legislation that has failed a cloture vote, but that had more than 50 votes behind it, the vast majority, something like 80%, are technically bipartisan in that they have yes votes from both parties. I'm curious, Will, can you help us interpret that number? You know, is that a trend that we would actually expect to continue if the filibuster were reformed? You know, how much is it true that the filibuster may actually be stifling bipartisanship, at least in its most technical sense?
I think it's really hard to pin down for the reason that Gisela and Ken pointed out, which is that if you change the rule, what's required to actually pass something, what you'll do is you'll change the composition of the pill, people's investment in it. And so it's hard to draw from the experience of, you know, what the votes were, how they were cast in a world in which we had the filibuster, to one, and to say, well, those would all pass as written in a world in which you don't have the filibuster. It would alter people's allotment of time, the agenda, all kinds of things. And so I think in the main, the lesson is the lesson that we're all pointing towards, which is you'd see just as a heightened chance that bills get enacted, an enrichment of debate, an expansion of discussion, a willingness of people to spend less time on grandstanding and appealing to a base and more in actually figuring out what the change in policy might look like, because now it's within sight, the change itself.
I also just want to jump in and say eliminating the filibuster would change the relationship between the House and the Senate, because they would actually have to be in dialogue with each other about what legislation looks like. And so legislation that the House has passed recently, knowing probably that it's not going to go anywhere in the Senate, might be tweaked if they knew that they needed to do something to get it through the Senate, or we would go back to seeing meaningful House Senate conference committees to work out differences. I also think it's really important that eliminating the filibuster would change what courts can do, because now courts have an almost unreviewable say about what legislation means. And so courts can say, well, this is what immigration law means, or this is what environmental law means, knowing that it will be virtually impossible for Congress to enact legislation to correct an erroneous judicial interpretation of a statute, which is a massive power shift to the federal courts. And of course, the Republican Party has been very focused on confirming very ideologically conservative judges, both justices and lower court judges, knowing that they will have the final say not only on what the Constitution means, but also on what legislation means. And if Congress had the realistic ability to enact legislation to change how courts have interpreted legislation, it would moderate what courts do, which would be all to the good.
Thank you. That feels like the right note to end on. We are just about at time. But I just finally want to say once again, thank you, Professor Shepsle, Sin, Fisk, and Howell. Thank you all for taking this hour today to answer important questions about the filibuster and its really consequential implications for our democracy as a whole, not just for short-term partisan political agendas. So again, I want to offer my thanks to all of you and to all of our remarkable colleagues at the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government and at Protect Democracy, who helped bring this event together today. Certainly fortuitous timing with the first filibuster of this Congress just last week. And so on behalf of both organizations, I want to thank all of you for joining us for this really rich, enlightening, complex discussion. We look forward to seeing you at the next one. And with that, I think we are at closure. Thank you all.